In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich was collapsing, many German civilians and auxiliary personnel were more afraid of capture than of the shells falling around them. For years they had heard stories that enemy soldiers would take revenge, that prisoners would be beaten, mutilated, or left to die. By April, these fears were everywhere. And for one young German woman, those fears became overwhelming when she looked down at her right hand and saw blood pouring through her fingers. It was the afternoon of April 18, 1945, near the town of Magdeburg in central Germany. American forces from the United States Army were pushing east toward the Elbe River. Roads were crowded with retreating troops, frightened civilians, and prisoners moving in every direction. In the confusion, a 23-year-old German woman named Erika Hoffmann was caught in the blast of an artillery round that struck near a roadside ditch where she had taken cover. The explosion did not kill her, but a piece of steel tore through her hand with terrible force. Bones were broken. Tendons were ripped. 2 fingers hung at unnatural angles. Blood soaked her coat sleeve in seconds. She screamed and wrapped her left hand around the injury, pressing as hard as she could. The pain was so sharp that it made her dizzy. Erika had spent the last years working as a clerk attached to a German supply office. She was not a frontline soldier, but by April 1945 distinctions meant little. Anyone moving with military units risked becoming a prisoner. As American troops approached, she and others were detained and placed under guard. When medics saw the condition of her hand, they rushed her to a nearby American field hospital. The ride there was the longest journey of her life. Inside the ambulance, she stared at the white stars painted on the vehicles and felt a wave of terror stronger than the pain. She had grown up hearing that the enemy would show no mercy. In her mind, one thought repeated again and again, "They will cut my hand off." The words poured from her through tears. She begged the interpreter. She begged the medics. She begged anyone who might understand. Her hand was her future. She wrote with it, worked with it, cooked with it. The idea of waking to find it gone filled her with more fear than death itself. When the ambulance stopped, 2 medics carried her through canvas doors into a large surgical tent. The smell hit her first: ether, iodine, blood, damp canvas, and mud. Cots filled every corner. Surgeons moved from patient to patient with sleeves rolled up and faces marked by exhaustion. Outside, engines rumbled and stretchers arrived without pause. An American nurse cut away the blood-soaked bandages. Erika turned her face away. She could not bear to look. Then a tall, thin surgeon stepped to her bedside. He was Captain Robert Ellison, a hand-trained orthopedic surgeon from Chicago who had spent months repairing shattered limbs across Europe. He had seen injuries from mines, bullets, and shell fragments. He knew immediately that Erika's hand was in critical condition. Several bones in the hand were fractured. Tendons had been severed. One artery appeared badly damaged. If circulation could not be restored quickly, tissue would die. The simplest solution was obvious: amputate. In wartime medicine, amputation was often the safest and fastest choice. It reduced infection risk, conserved resources, and allowed surgeons to move on to the next casualty. In a crowded field hospital with dozens of wounded waiting, time mattered. Captain Ellison studied the hand in silence. He flexed one finger. No response. He checked for warmth. The skin was cooling. He searched for a pulse in the damaged vessels. Very weak. The nurse looked at him. Another surgeon nearby glanced over and gave a subtle shrug, as if to say there was little hope. Erika watched their faces and broke down completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Through an interpreter, she repeated the same desperate sentence. "They will cut my hand off." Captain Ellison listened. Then he made a decision that would tie up his operating table for the next 4 hours. He was going to try to save it. Erika did not understand at first. She saw only the nurse's calmer expression and the surgeon's steady eyes. Morphine dulled the sharp edges of pain, but not her fear. As orderlies rolled her toward the operating table, she was certain this was the last time she would see her hand intact. Rain drummed softly on the canvas overhead. Lamps cast harsh white circles onto the surgical field. Instruments were laid out in careful rows: clamps, scalpels, forceps, needles, wire, and bone tools. Supplies were limited. The conditions were far from the clean operating rooms of American hospitals. But Captain Ellison had learned to do precise work in difficult places. The anesthetist administered ether. Erika's breathing slowed. Her eyes closed. The first hour was devoted to cleaning the wound. Shell fragments, dirt, and torn tissue had to be removed. Every minute mattered. Infection was a deadly enemy. The surgeon irrigated the injury repeatedly, exposing the true extent of the damage. The metacarpal bones were shattered. Flexor tendons were severed. The radial side blood vessel was badly torn. Nerve tissue was exposed. The hand looked almost beyond repair. Outside the tent, trucks arrived with more casualties. Medics shouted for plasma and bandages. Inside, Captain Ellison remained focused on one shattered hand belonging to a woman who, only hours earlier, had considered him the enemy. During the second hour, he stabilized the broken bones. Using fine wire and careful alignment, he rebuilt the framework of the hand. This was delicate work. If the bones healed in the wrong position, her grip would be permanently damaged. The nurse blotted sweat from his forehead. He asked for another clamp. He adjusted one fragment by only a few millimeters. The bones finally held. The third hour was the most difficult. Tendons had to be identified and reconnected. Each tendon was like a cable controlling motion. If shortened or twisted, fingers would not bend properly. Under dim field lighting, the surgeon stitched the torn ends together with painstaking precision. Then came the artery. Without blood flow, nothing else would matter. The damaged ends were trimmed. Tiny sutures were placed. The room seemed to grow quieter as everyone watched. When the clamps were released, a few seconds passed that felt much longer. Then the fingers began to pink. Warmth returned. The nurse smiled behind her mask. Circulation was back. But Captain Ellison was not finished. In the fourth hour, he repaired nerve tissue as carefully as conditions allowed and closed the wound in layers, leaving drainage to reduce infection risk. Finally, he positioned the hand and forearm in a protective plaster splint. When he stepped away from the table, he was physically drained. 4 hours had passed. In a busy wartime hospital, 4 hours was an extraordinary investment for a single hand, especially the hand of a prisoner. Erika awoke slowly in the recovery ward. Her throat burned from ether. Her head felt heavy. For several moments she did not remember where she was. Then she looked down. Her right arm was wrapped in thick bandages and plaster. The hand was still there. She stared in disbelief. The nurse beside her nodded gently. No one needed to translate the meaning. The hand had been saved. Erika began to cry again, but these were not the same tears that had filled the ambulance. This time they came from relief so intense that she could hardly breathe. The enemy she had feared most had spent 4 hours fighting to preserve the part of her body she thought she would lose forever. The days that followed were uncertain. Saving the hand in surgery was only the beginning. Infection could still set in. Blood flow could fail. Tissue could die. Each dressing change was tense. Captain Ellison checked the fingers regularly. Color was good. Temperature was improving. Capillary refill was present. There was cautious optimism. After several days, Erika was able to move one finger slightly under the bandages. It was a tiny motion, almost invisible to others, but to her it felt like a miracle. As she recovered, her view of the Americans began to change. The nurses brought food and adjusted her blankets. Medics spoke to her kindly, even when they shared no common language. She watched wounded men from both armies lying under the same canvas roof, treated according to the severity of their injuries rather than the uniforms they had worn. The propaganda that had shaped her fears began to collapse. Weeks later, after the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the splint was removed. The hand was stiff, scarred, and weak. 2 fingers moved poorly. Sensation was incomplete. But the hand was alive, functional, and attached. For Erika, that was everything. Rehabilitation was painful. She had to relearn simple tasks. Picking up a spoon felt difficult. Writing was slow and clumsy. The hand ached in cold weather, yet month by month strength improved. She eventually returned to civilian life in a devastated Germany. Cities were in ruins, families were scattered, work was scarce. But she could use both hands. She could write letters. She could prepare meals. She could sew and carry groceries. She could build a future. Years passed. The scars remained, a raised map across the back of her hand and fingers. When she looked at them, she remembered the shell blast, the ambulance, and the terror that had seized her when she believed amputation was certain. But she also remembered the surgeon. Captain Robert Ellison returned to the United States after the war. Like many military doctors, he carried memories that stayed with him for life. Thousands of wounded passed across his operating table, yet certain cases stood apart, not because of rank or nationality, but because they captured something essential about medicine in wartime: the duty to heal. Even when the patient wore the enemy's uniform, even when supplies were scarce, even when others said the easier path was to amputate. For surgeons at American field hospitals, these decisions happened every day. They worked in mud, cold, and exhaustion. They performed complex procedures under canvas with limited equipment. Their goal was not revenge. Their mission was to save life and function whenever possible. Erika's hand became one small example of that larger truth. Decades later, she told her children about the day she was certain she would lose her hand. She described the fear, the tears, and the extraordinary relief of waking to find her fingers still wrapped beneath the bandages. With that hand, she signed employment forms and marriage papers. With that hand, she held her children. With that hand, she buttoned coats, peeled potatoes, and turned the pages of books. Ordinary acts, repeated thousands of times, were possible because one exhausted surgeon refused to choose the quickest solution. The story also reveals a deeper reality of war. Battles are often remembered for tanks, aircraft, and generals. But hidden behind those larger events are moments that quietly reshape human lives: a surgeon bending over a damaged hand, a prisoner discovering mercy where she expected cruelty. 4 hours in a canvas tent while a world war came to its end. In April 1945, Germany was collapsing. Cities burned. Armies surrendered. Millions faced uncertainty. Hatred had consumed Europe for years. Yet in the middle of that destruction, an American officer devoted his skill and time to preserving the hand of a frightened young German woman. He did not know what her future would be. He did not know whether she would ever fully recover. He simply saw a patient whose hand could still be saved. And he tried. The operation was not glamorous. There were no reporters, no medals, and no headlines. Just a difficult injury, a risky decision, and 4 hours of disciplined surgical work. But for Erika, the result shaped the rest of her life more than any speech or battle ever could. When she first entered the field hospital, she believed her captors would take something from her forever. Instead, they gave something back: trust, dignity, and the use of her own hand. You can almost imagine the moment years later when she looked at her fingers resting on a kitchen table. The scars were still visible. The movement was not perfect, but the hand was there, steady and strong enough to hold a cup, write a note, or touch the face of a child. Every scar told the same story. A shell fragment had nearly destroyed it. Fear had convinced her it was already lost. And an American surgeon, surrounded by the chaos of war, spent 4 hours proving otherwise. That is what makes this moment unforgettable. Not the scale of the battle, but the scale of the decision. In a time when nations were trying to destroy one another, one man chose to preserve what remained. For Erika Hoffmann, the sound she remembered most was not artillery. It was the quiet reassurance that came when she woke and saw the bandaged shape at the end of her arm. Her hand was still there. And with it, so was her future.